Chapter 15. Daddy's Little Learner. Hardcore. For all Terry's and my good intentions, and maybe Mum's as well, there was little chance that the three of us would be able to establish a relationship after so long apart, and after everything that we'd all been through along the way. Our new little family unit lasted exactly 6 weeks, and it was a bumpy ride from day one. I don't doubt that both Terry and I were complete pains in the neck for Mum, and that having had no one to worry about but herself for the last 8 years, it was a bit of a shock to suddenly find herself in charge of two difficult teenagers she hardly knew, and who harboured incredible resentments towards her. But it was still a disappointment to find her defeated so easily. We had changed schools yet again in order to attend one closer to our new home, and I was refusing to go in at all, not wanting to start all over again with people I didn't know. I'd had enough of having to prove myself in new social groups, dealing with new bullies all over again and having to show them who was boss. I just wanted to be left alone and maybe have a bit of fun out of life. I would skive up to the city with friends instead, drinking and generally playing up. There were a lot of arguments at home, as Mum attempted in vain to exercise some sort of parental control, which I counteracted with large doses of adolescence resentment, ended up slashing my wrists and taking an overdose yet again. Social services were called, and Mum was forced to admit she couldn't cope with us. After things had gone wrong with Mum, Terry and I were taken into care again. I was heartbroken that my dreams of having a proper family had come to nothing, and I was even more devastated when I was told that Terry and I were going to be separated this time. I was taken to a place called Bramerton Lodge, while Terry was moved into a hostel to have a go at some sort of independent living. I couldn't understand why we weren't both returned to break, and I felt rejected and abandoned by them as well as by my mother. I knew my behaviour wasn't great, but the things I did, cutting myself, taking overdoses, prostitution, drinking myself into a stupor, were hurting me much more than anyone else. I was crying out for help, and no one at all was responding. Bramerton was a remand and an assessment centre in the countryside outside Norwich. It was considered to be the last chance for kids like me, after which prison or borstal were the only options open to us. The building, which had ominous-looking bars at the window, was struck in a field in the middle of nowhere. I was told I would be there for just 6 weeks while they decided what to do with me. But in fact, I would stay there for the best part of 3 years on and off. It was completely different to any home I'd been in before, with a very strict, controlled routine. My first night there, I walked into the common room with a big, bullshit attitude. "How do I get out of this dump?" I asked loudly. The other kids all laughed, telling me there was no way of getting out. The place was far too secure. On many occasions over the next few years, I would prove that it wasn't. But I remember feeling very lonely and scared that night, wondering what on earth was going to happen to me next. The scenery around Bramerton was beautiful, filled with idyllic, well-cared-for little villages where people lived pleasant, tidy lives so unlike mine it was hard to imagine. The place itself, however, was more or less a children's prison. I was forever being locked up and punished for trivial rule-breaking, like being caught in possession of a cigarette lighter. If we wanted to light our cigarettes, we were supposed to ask a member of staff. I suppose they thought we would burn the place down if we had our own lighters, but we could probably have done that with a lighted cigarette almost as easily. On the whole, However, it wasn't a bad place. They even gave us a fag allowance. They had their own little school on the premises, which I hated from the start. Pupils spent their whole time making moccasins or nail felt to boards. A bit like prisoners sewing mail bags, none of which I had any time for, and the teacher seemed really up himself. Initially, I spent 6 weeks there while they tried to work out what to do with me next. They soon discovered, however, that no one else wanted to take me on, and that they were pretty much stuck with me. It's not hard to see why. On paper, I did not look like a good bet. It was common knowledge by then that I was on the game, and it was on the record that I kept running away from anywhere they took me to, trying to get back to my dad, who was the source of all my problems. I guess I ran away all the time, partly because Dad told me so, but also partly because that was what Mum had done with us, and because I never felt like I belonged anywhere, so there was no reason to resist the temptation to move on. I was always hoping that the grass would be greener somewhere else, despite constant disappointments. And wherever they put me, I always wanted to escape back to Dad, the one place where I felt I belonged, however horrible the reality of it might end up being once I got there. Social services had tried many times to get me back into mainstream schooling, but I would always decide I hated my new school and would spend my days skivvying off and drinking tea with a group of people who used to hang around the city centre. That's how I ended up being put in Bramerton. But despite the warnings from the other kids, I found it wasn't too hard to escape from there when I wanted to head back into the city centre. It wasn't long after I arrived at Bramerton before I struck up a relationship with a man nearly 20 years older than me. It's surprising how many men are willing to get involved with a young girl in care. He even asked me to marry him and bought an engagement ring from his friend's catalogue. Apart from the fact I was still only 14, he should maybe have picked up the signals that whenever he tried to have sex with me, I would cry and panic. Social services were writing reports saying how promiscuous I was, but actually I hated sex, and it seemed quite obvious now that I wanted older men like this guy to be father figures to me. I was looking for love and protection in all the wrong places and in completely the wrong ways. In December that year, Mum gave birth to my baby brother, Adam, and I went to the hospital with my new boyfriend to visit them. Things between Mum and me were very strained. I don't think we'd ever spoken since Terry and I had been taken back into care, so the visit was a little awkward. But my new brother was the most adorable thing I had ever seen. He was so beautiful and I loved him at once. That's when I got the idea in my head that it would be wonderful to have a baby of my own to care for. It soon became obvious, though, that I wasn't really welcome to visit, and that I wasn't going to be a part of Mum's or Adam's lives. Since leaving us back when I was 6, she'd never sent Christmas or birthday cards, and that had always hurt. After our failed reunion and subsequent separation again, I hoped with all my heart that the door could be left open with Mum. But when no card arrived at Christmas, I knew for sure she didn't want me. Mum had said that she was determined to be a brilliant mum to Adam, as she screwed it up with her other kids, and she wasn't going to do the same with this one. I can honestly say I was never jealous of my baby brother. I have never resented him, but I did her. From the moment we left her new house, Mum cut us off as completely as she had when she first left us. We got no calls, no cards, no letters, no visits. It was like we had ceased to exist for her once more. I tried writing letters to her, but I received no response. I suppose she was hoping to make a clean start with her new baby and didn't want any of the ugliness of the past to intrude. It was at this point I gave up on everything. I felt I had finally lost everyone, even Terry Jr. Social services had told me that there wasn't a children's home or foster home in the country that would take me. It felt as though everyone had given up on me, although I guess they were doing the best they could to find a solution to an almost impossible problem. Escaping had become like second nature to me. As soon as I saw an opportunity to get back to Dad, if he was out of jail or back to my friends in the city pubs, I would take it. I dare say it was also obvious to anyone with experience in dealing with difficult teenagers that I had started doing drugs as well as drinking. In Bremerton, I was mixing with some pretty hardcore people, aged from 12 up to 18. We used to sniff glue and aerosols, none of us wanting to say no when it was offered and risk looking like wimps. I never liked it, particularly the glue, because it only gave you a hit for a few seconds and then left you with a nasty headache. Aerosols wasn't so bad, but I preferred more grown-up drugs if I could get hold of them. Through my friends in the pubs, I got hold of cannabis and tried that. Then I moved on to speed, which would become my drug of choice for the next 5 years. I was generally pretty uncooperative and difficult with anyone who tried to tell me what to do. I guess the refusing to do what people told me stemmed from having Dad ordering me around for so many years, bullying me into doing things that I really didn't want to do. If people asked me nicely, I could be cooperative. But the sort of people who worked in a place like Bremerton didn't always have the time or inclination for such niceties, which meant I didn't always react well to them. The couple who ran the home, Mr. and Mrs. Macquarie, kept their distance from me at first, but I remember I was all so nervous if I was called up to see them for some misdemeanour or other. Mr. Macquarie was the sort of man who automatically commanded respect, a man with a headmasterly presence. Most of the anger that I had boiling away inside me was directed towards myself. I was often slashing my wrists or other parts of my body in self-disgust, taking overdoses or sitting in a bath trying to scrape myself clean with neat bleach and a scrubbing brush, not bothered that I was rubbing so hard that I was drawing blood. Some of the other girls were anorexic and bulimic, and I was just as convinced as they were that I was overweight, and I used to long to be like them. I would try to make myself sick after meals, as I saw them doing. They never worked. I would push my fingers down my throat, but it would only make me gag. I could never actually rid myself of any food. My body repelled me because Dad had repeatedly told me how fat and ugly it was, and because of the way it had been bought and sold so cheaply, used and disposed of over and over again by anyone with £10 and a few minutes to spare. There was a fashion amongst the girls at Bremerton for tattooing one another with needles and Indian ink. The staff didn't take much notice of that sort of thing. I suppose it was a pretty harmless pastime compared with suicide attempts and arson. I actually tattooed the word Dad on my forearm because I still felt I belonged to him and truly believed I always would. I started out doing it with a needle and ink, but it was taking so long I got bored and finished the job off by slashing clumsily away with a Stanley blade. Having learnt my lesson that day back at junior school, when I turned on the bullies who were picking on me, I was determined to establish a reputation for being the hardest girl in Bremerton, so that I would never get into a position where I might be bullied. I'd had enough of being a victim at Dad's hands and with scumbags like his mate Pete, and all the pathetic punters in their shiny motors. I wasn't willing to accept it from anyone else ever. I hated violence, but I knew that I would have to establish my credentials amongst these hard cases if I wanted to avoid being picked on and beaten up the whole time. Over time, I became top dog amongst the girls, particularly because I was there longer than most other people and knew my way around, and partly because I protected my position with my fists. I made sure my reputation against the girls was established quickly, showing that I would never be afraid to use violence under any circumstances if I was pushed. I must have been convincing because I hardly ever had to actually fight. Just fronting up to people was enough. But I knew I had to be prepared to prove how hard I really was at any time. Every new girl who came in was going to test the boundaries to see if she would be able to take over my spot at the top of the pile. I could never allow that to happen. I wasn't a bully at all myself. I would never pick on anyone weaker than me. I was more of an agony aunt to most of them, but now and again I had to assert my authority and stick up for myself because someone was challenging my authority. I felt the other girls were constantly watching to see how I reacted to challenges, waiting for me to show a weakness. After I'd been there a few months, a new girl grasped me up for something. Can't remember what. And the crowd formed with the other girls who knew me threatening her that I would beat her up after lights out. It was almost as though they were proud of how hard I was and looked forward to watching how I was going to show this upstart the error of her ways, putting her in her place. Grassing on anyone was a cardinal sin in a place like Bremerton, so I knew they were going to expect me to dole out some sort of punishment. I hoped that if I came on aggressively enough, the new girl would crack and apologise and quickly prove that she had no bottle. I would then be able to just issue a warning and walk away without doing any damage. I had a feeling from the disdainful look she was giving me and the mocking tone of her voice, however, that she wasn't going to be that sort of girl. She was going to be prepared to call my bluff. I was feeling sick with anticipation of what I was going to have to do as a group of us went to her bedroom that night. Psyched up like an adolescent lynch mob, I didn't want to have to do anything, but I could tell from her attitude as she faced us down that she was after my position, and she wasn't going to back away. She was out to prove how tough she was, just as I was, and it was reaching a point where it would look like weakness in either of us if we conceded any ground. I knew I was going to have to use violence, and in the heat of the argument, I acted instinctively, picking up a piece of broken glass and threatening to slash her face. Even as the words came out of my mouth, I was praying she would back down because I really didn't want to do it. The thought of slashing anyone's face made me feel terrified. I would rather have just punched her, but I'd made my stand and reached a point where I couldn't actually drop the piece of glass without looking soft. The other girls were baying for blood, goading me on, accusing me of losing it. I really didn't want to do it, but I couldn't think how to get out of the situation without losing the high ground. My mind was racing, and I was buzzing with adrenaline. There wasn't time to try to reason my way out of the situation. Making a snap decision, I slashed the edge of the broken glass across her hand rather than her face. I wish I'd had the courage to tell them all to fuck off, put the glass down and walked away. But I wasn't ready for that. The blood flowed from her cut, and all hell broke loose as the girl became hysterical and the staff were called. They came running, and my victim was rushed away to hospital for stitches. They marched me off to a little room downstairs and locked me in. One member of staff, a man who really hated me, was so pleased that I'd finally overstepped the mark, he couldn't stop himself from gloating. "We've got you now, Maria. You're going to Holloway now." The notorious women's prison was always a threat they hung over me. I thought he was probably right, but I felt so bad about what I'd done and the sort of person I had become that I didn't really care anymore. I thought I deserved to go to prison. The staff called the police, who took me away for a night in the cells. In the court the next morning, Mr. and Mrs. Macquarie turned up to give evidence. Seeing them made me even more certain that I was on my way to prison. I knew that they all thought I was out of hand and that this would be their big chance to get shot of me. To my surprise, Mr. Macquarie stood up in court and fought tooth and nail to get me remanded back to Bramerton's, arguing that if I went to Holloway, I would be on a downhill road that I would probably never recover from. I felt so guilty about what I'd done, that even I thought I deserved to go to prison, but Mr. Macquarie's pleading swayed the court, and they agreed that I should be taken back to Bramerton and given another chance. The other girl was moved somewhere else for her own safety, which didn't seem fair to me. But the whole incident cemented my reputation as someone you didn't mess with unless you wanted to end up hurt, humiliated and shipped out. I realised that the Macquaries had put their necks on the line for me, and it was a real wake-up call. I believed they were right in what they said, and that if I'd gone to Holloway, it would have been the end of the line for me. I would have become like the other women in there, and I would have been destined for a life of violence and crime from the moment I walked through the door. As well as being surprised, I was deeply grateful and moved that they'd stuck up for me. Not many people had ever spoken out for me before. Soon after that, Mrs. Macquarie came to see me one day when I was working in the kitchens, and she invited me to sit down and have a fag with her in the office. This soon became a regular thing. She invited me into her office most days to have cups of coffee and cigarettes with her, like we were friends. Other members of staff used to come in and tell me it was time to go into school, but she would stick up for me. No, she would brush them aside. She's all right. I got a little job for her later. I used to love watching her in action. She only had one hand because of an accident when she was young. Although she had a false hand, she never used it. But it was amazing what she could do one-handed. The phone wedged between her shoulder and ear, a cigarette dangling from the corner of her mouth, and writing something at the same time. It would make me laugh just to watch her juggling all her jobs at once. She and her husband showed a lot of kindness after saving me from prison. I think I must have become a bit of a pet project for them. The Christmas after Mama kicked us out, I had nowhere to go during the holiday period. I confided in Mrs. Macquarie about how hurt I was that Mum never got in touch with us. "Why don't you send her a card?" she suggested. "You're a grown-up too now. Maybe you could make the first move towards another reconciliation." I did, as she suggested, but I still didn't hear anything back. Mum couldn't have made it any clearer that she wanted nothing more to do with us. All the other children at Bramerton were going back to friends and relatives for the holiday, and there was just going to be me and a lovely lad called Martin left behind. To my total astonishment, the Macquaries did this amazing thing. They sent their entire staff home and stayed at Bramerton themselves, instead of going to their own house in Norwich. On Christmas Day, they brought Martin and me breakfast in bed and turned the dining room into a proper family room, bringing in their family Christmas tree and decorations and buying us both presents. I've still got the silver bangle they gave me. After lunch, we sat around watching television together. They could have employed staff to deal with us, but they chose instead to give up their own Christmas break for us. It still hurt to think that our families didn't want us, but it was so touching that the Macquaries would do that for us, especially when I had given them nothing but trouble. I was overwhelmed by the gesture, feeling that I was unworthy of it, but they couldn't have been nicer. On the Boxing Day of that year, another little girl had to come back to join us because her baby nephew had died of a cot death, which made me feel less sorry for myself. So many people in Bremerton were in an even worse state than me. For years afterwards I would hear about other children I knew during those years, and there would be stories of how they were now heavily into their drugs or in prison or dead. Many of them have been too damaged at the start of their lives to be able to cope with the pressures of the real world once they were forced to go out into it. I may have started to get closer to Mrs. Macquarie, but it didn't make me calm down and become an angel. Overnight, there was an incident with another girl in Bremerton, which added even more to my reputation as someone you shouldn't mess with. This girl was on the game too, so she must have been pretty tough. We always had to wait outside the dining room before we were allowed to go in for meals. And when I asked her before one meal what the time was, she was really rude to me. "Whatever is your fucking problem?" I wanted to know. "Don't talk to me like that." "You think you're so special," she spat back. She was still mouthing off as we went in and took our places around one of the big circular tables. She sat down opposite me, carefully poured herself a cup of tea, stood up and threw it over me. I sat for a few seconds, dripping and gathering my thoughts. I then stood up, picked up the giant teapot, which was filled and ready to serve to the whole table, lifted the lid, and hurled the entire contents at her, flooding the beautiful laminate floor which had to be buffed every day to keep its shine, leaving no one in any doubt that I wasn't going to be pushed around without fighting back. Fortunately, the tea wasn't hot enough to cause scalding, but it was uncomfortable all the same. Everyone else at the table leapt up as a tidal wave of hot liquid exploded across them, and the staff were trying to get me in order to restrain me before I attacked the girl again, all of them slipping and sliding around on the wet floor while the boys cheered and jeered their encouragement. "Go on, Ria!" It was like a slapstick scene from a Laurel and Hardy movie. We both got punished for that outburst, but I didn't feel as guilty as I did about the glassing, partly because she had been the first one to throw the tea, but mainly because it had been so funny watching everyone falling about, and because no one ended up being badly hurt. Not surprisingly, I didn't trust any men at that age, and I could be pretty horrible to any that crossed my path and displeased me. Dad had always told me how you couldn't trust the men who worked in children's homes because they were all perverts, and I believed him. Looking back now, I know there were some really nice chaps working in the homes who I didn't give a chance to, men who genuinely wanted to help troubled youngsters like me. There had been one male carer at break who I was always accusing of trying to see me in the bath, although looking back I'm sure nothing of the sort had ever crossed his mind. Having said that, there were a few men who made the girls feel uneasy at Bremerton. We weren't allowed to have any locks on our doors, so we had no privacy. And there were certain members of staff who seemed to pop up from nowhere, hovering around the corridors during bath times. There was one man who we knew used to take his shoes off to sneak upstairs at the time we were all getting undressed for bed. So we sprinkled drawing pins on the steps and gleefully listened to his muffled exclamations and shouts of pain as he stepped on them in his stockinged feet. There was one carer who particularly hated me. The home was built in a square with a house at each corner, all joined by corridors. At one corner was the laundry and the offices, on the other the boys' dormitory, then the girls' section, and finally a mixed-sex family type of setup. There were 5 or 6 bedrooms in the girls' part, a sitting room and a kitchen. At the end of each house was a staff flat, and this chap, who was a big ex-soldier, lived in the girls' house with his wife and children, who we never saw. I was intimidated by him, but determined not to let him know, so I tried to aggravate him as much as I could. We were meant to put our lights out and settle down at 10 o'clock, but we would deliberately make a lot of noise after that, just to wind him up. One night, at about midnight, he completely lost the plot, came storming in, ordering everyone out of their beds, even the girls who were innocently sleeping. He lined us up along the corridor and was screaming and spitting into my face, his complexion bright scarlet, while I was just standing laughing at him. I knew he wanted to hit me, but he couldn't without losing his job and ending up in court, and I exploited his impotence mercilessly. Because I'd been brought up to obey Dad, or suffer the physical consequences. People who were put in positions of authority over me, but weren't allowed to touch me, had real trouble making me do anything I didn't want to do. It must have driven that one guy absolutely crazy. But he had to back down or risk losing his job. If I liked a carer, I might try to please them. But I just wanted to give the others a hard time. Maybe I was taking revenge for all the times Dad had beaten me when I'd done nothing wrong, trying to even up the scales in a warped kind of way. Bramerton was only meant to be for short stays, but I was there almost solidly between the ages of 14 and 17. A couple of times they tried to move me on to halfway house establishments, where I could live independently within a community, to try to prepare me for coping on my own in the outside world. But the first time that happened, I was accused of stealing some money, which I never did. And the second time I was accused of drug dealing because I scored some acid for 2 other girls while I was in town. So both times I ended back up at Bramerton again, feeling like a failure. It was surprising that anyone still held out any hope for me at all by that stage. It looked as though I was doomed to be in a downward spiral forever, just like in the nightmare I used to have when I lived with Dad. Falling into nothingness, certain that it could only end with my death.